Hey, it's Minute Book Reports, and in this video I wanted to rank all of the series of unfortunate events books and go through them sort of one by one and just sort of talk about my least favorite to my most favorite. And you know, this video is definitely not for people who haven't read the series or who are just watching the Netflix show. I think this video is for people who read the books and they're just curious and they might also have opinions on which of the entire series was their favorite. And so I just want to make my list, as I had just finished reading the entire series, enjoyed it very, very much, and just wanted to put this together. I should mention that this is by no means saying that any of the books are bad. I really try not to say that books are bad. I try to point out some of the positives, or at least something that I got out of the book. Maybe I can suggest things that I wish they would have done, but I would never say that a book is like terrible and just ranting and hating on the book. So this order should not mean that a certain book is lesser quality. It's just which ones did I enjoy the most and which ones to me weren't as strong. So they're all strong, but just some were stronger than others. So number 13 was The Reptile Room, and this is our first introduction to basically what would be the general story for a lot of the books, which is the Baudelaires go to a guardian. The guardian doesn't recognize Count Olaf when he comes into their life again. Then the children over time sort of unravel the plan. Everyone figures out, oh look, it's Count Olaf. And then Count Olaf runs away, and then the children go to their next guardian. And we see this repeated several times in this series. And this was the first time that we got that. And you know, it's when I first read this series, I didn't understand a lot of the things. I was getting used to the narration, I was getting used to the characters, and also the ineptitude of some of the guardians. And it was kind of hard because I thought that Uncle Monty was very nice. He was obviously very intelligent, very well educated, and yet he could not recognize Count Olaf. Now, granted, he had never seen Count Olaf before, but I think the fact that he refused to listen to the children kind of surprised me in a lot of ways. What I was hoping was that Uncle Monty would take the children to his expedition to Peru, and that never really happened. I felt like the story was leading that way, and it was leaning towards them making the boat and going off on this journey, and I thought that would have been great. But actually, that they're not even close. They actually never even leave the home towards that journey, I should say. And it's a little disappointing because I thought that would have been nice, you know, because the first book was very much in the town, in a house, and second book we'd be going off on an adventure. I thought that'd be really great, but that doesn't actually end up happening. So that to me was a little bit of a disappointment. But Uncle Monty was a very likable character, and one of the characters that I am a little disappointed that they I guess in a way killed off so quickly. But you know, I had to start somewhere with this list, and to me this was my least favorite, or almost least memorable of all the books, even though it's the second book. So I had to start somewhere. So this is my number 13. Number 12 is The Wide Window, and very much like The Reptile Room, this is now the third book, The Wide Window. It follows that same storyline where we are introduced to another guardian who is very much inept and she just doesn't get it, which is Aunt Josephine. And the children, they don't understand why no one seems to be helping them. It's so obvious, right? But none of the adults can figure it out. One of the things that I think is so important, and I know that the show does it differently, is the motivation of Aunt Josephine. When they're on the boat at the end, the way that I read the book was that Aunt Josephine was selling out the kids, was that she was trying to save herself from being pushed into the lake, and she just wanted to give up the kids and make a deal with Count Olaf. And to me, that hurt her character a lot towards the end. In the show, they kind of make it a little bit more redeeming, where she gains courage again. You know, she becomes that person that she used to be. But in the show, or in the book, it's not like that. She is not strong at all. And you know, for her character, she has two sort of quirks, two things that are what I would sort of attribute to being sort of bad characteristics. She has the whole grammar thing where it's very difficult for her to let people speak and write and say things in poor grammar. But she also has this fear of everything, which is, I would say, an unreasonable fear, especially because she lives on the lake. I could understand, something traumatic happening and then you want to move, and that would be the most reasonable thing. But she continues to live at the lake despite what happened to her husband. So it's sort of almost like this self-inflicted reminder, this painful reminder to herself about what happened. And so I feel like her character is a very weak character, and she doesn't redeem herself in this story. But I do want to point out that I love the idea that there was a secret code and that she used a secret code to communicate to the kids, and that Klaus was able to figure it out. Because I know that in the book they show you the letter that has all the grammatical errors, and then you could figure it out, but to be honest, I wouldn't have figured it out. I would have noticed that the letter was written very poorly, and I would have wondered why, but it would have been too complicated for me to figure out what those letters actually meant, and all those different trying to unscramble the words and all that. So I give them a lot of credit, and I really like that. I wish that they would have done that a little bit more in this series, but we don't really get that too much. But again, The Wide Window, I thought it was an okay book. I do realize that a lot of the book, the kids are on their own because Aunt Josephine kind of disappears and does her own thing because she leaves for a while, and the kids kind of have to be on their own for a while, which is exciting, But again, we're just meeting these characters as the third book, and it would have been nice to kind of like build that bond between them and the Guardians. And I guess that was never meant to be something in this series, but I just felt like it would have been nice, especially early on, because we don't really know sort of what's going on and all the things that are sort of with the Bawdlers and their parents. We don't really understand that. So it would have been nice to have some of that context. Number 11 is the Ersatz Elevator. And, this was a really is an interesting story. The commentary on social trends that we see through not just the high class, but especially through Mrs. Squalor, I think is spot on. I think that is very, very good commentary. It's this idea that we shift our likes and dislikes so quickly that sometimes it's hard to keep up. And it's very comical in this book, in the story, but it's something that we actually do in real life. And as I was reading it, I thought, wow, like I wonder if people are actually gonna see the truth that that small actually is more of a big kernel, but that very small element of truth in this commentary about how flippant we are, about how we switch what we like and don't like so often, and it's really not for any good reason other than that sort of what society or culture sort of dictates. And so I really like that about this book. The things that I didn't particularly enjoy were, well, the first thing was I didn't like the fact that the stairs had to be used all the time. And I understand that you use the stairs because the elevators weren't working, and that was a big plot point. And you also got to hear people as they were walking up the stairs. You could hear the other people in the other apartments. But I didn't like the fact that I felt like every time they walked up or down the stairs, it slowed down the story. And I felt like as they were doing that, I felt tired. And I know that seems ridiculous, and maybe it's hard to understand, but it slowed down the momentum of the story. And I was like, oh, I really want to skip this part as they're walking up and down the stairs, I think there are better ways to handle movement of characters. But I clearly understand the elevator being out was a part of this story, but it was just it was very slow to me. The biggest thing that threw me off in this story that I don't know, I guess in a lot of ways I felt like it was a really big tease, was the red herring at the end where there's the box labeled VFD, and everyone, like, I'm thinking, all right, we're finally going to get some answers, like we're finally going to figure out what's going on here. And we don't get that because it's the doilies. And I was like, oh gosh, why'd you guys do that? And it does leave some edge, some drama that keeps us wanting to read. But I think if you do that too much to an audience, to your readers, then they don't take things seriously, and everything becomes a cliffhanger. But then the cliffhanger is not paid off at the end. And I felt like with the VFD and the auction and all of that, it kind of didn't pay off. They end up escaping again, and it would have been nice to have some of that mystery sort of a little bit uncovered, because at book number 6 we're basically halfway through the series, and it would have been nice to know a little bit more about what the heck is going on. So that to me was somewhat of a disappointment, as something that I wish that I would have known a little bit more of, but I guess we find that out later on. Number 10 is The Vile Village, and this was, again, one of those good social commentaries on society and what happens when we have too many strict rules. So I appreciate that commentary, that the entire village would raise these kids so it wouldn't be one single person, but that they really had a lot of rules for everything, almost to the point where it was so controlling you couldn't do anything. And it's this balance of the freedom of individuals and their rights versus, for the common good. And again, maybe for a kid's book, maybe for a kid's series, that's not what kids may necessarily pull out, but that's what I got out of it. That's one of the things that I hope people see, especially when this becomes the Netflix show. And I hope that they highlight that, and they kind of probably make it funny, but it's something that is very relevant. So I like the fact that we have this. However, it was kind of sad that we never really got closure on Hector as a character who takes away the Quagmire, I was going to say twins, but the triplets. The two Quagmire siblings and Hector, they drift off, and we never hear from them or see them again. And that, to me, is not the conclusion of a story. This was one of the books that didn't really have an ending, because basically the kids run away. And not just Hector and the other two, but the Buttlers, they just walk away from the village, and it had no closure, and so as I was reading this story, I was like, they went to this village and they solved a puzzle, but they never actually did anything, because of course, Count Olaf runs away at the end, but they didn't really solve what the problem was, because to me the major conflict was against the village. It was all the rules. It was them not being able to do the things that they liked, whether it was inventing or reading, and I felt like that wasn't solved. The villagers didn't change, they just stayed the same, and there's no resolution to this story. But I do want to point out that I like the fact that finally we have a little bit of growing up from Sunny. The book ends with her being able to stand and kind of walk, and I'm so thankful for that. I mentioned this in some of my other videos, that I felt like Sunny as a character is fun and cute, but she's a drag in the context of the three Baudelaire siblings, because she can't talk really, and she can't walk because she's just an infant. And so what that means in the story is that Violet or Klaus, but most often Violet, will have to carry her, and that limits their movement, that limits the abilities of Violet. But the fact that now Sunny can walk on her own, stand on her own 2 feet, I like that. I'm glad we get to see some development, not just as the characters go on, but just physical development for her, and she's able to walk and eventually talk, and I like that. It's like finally we're able to see that. So that was one of the positives that I felt in this book. For me, as a reader, I really liked, because that was one of the things that really bothered me for a long time. Number 9, The Grim Grotto. So this was an interesting book. We meet some new characters that I wish we would have seen more. I like Fiona as a character. The addition of the triangle glasses I thought was very nice. But I like that she has a sort of thing with Klaus because they like to read, and she is an expert in a field that is not, it hasn't really been explored so much. You have these children that they have these gifts of cartography and poetry and reading and research and inventing things and cooking and all that. But there was never really one that was like science, straight up just science. And Fiona is an expert in fungi, which I thought was really interesting, and that the fungi plays a very important role in this story. But she exits the story with her brother and her stepfather, and we don't know what happens to them. I love the fact that she's a very good character that we get to know, because she's with the bottlers for a lot of this story, and then she eventually will turn and she kind of joins Count Olaf, but then at the end she lets them go, so she's a good person again. I'm not really sure how that's resolved, but her brother, the hook-handed man, that was a very, very nice little twist there that we got. But there are a couple of things in this story that I wish they would have gone more into, that we get introduced and teased to, and maybe in the later books they explain these a lot more, but I felt like it never really was explained. The biggest one was the question mark on the sonar. We don't know who or what that is. It's just some kind of big thing in the water that Count Olaf is afraid of, and I'm trying to figure out who or what that could possibly be. Maybe it's in the fan fiction or the lore, or I just skipped over it, but I felt like that was a big deal, but we never really get that, or I never really got that closure. They see it a couple of times, and I thought it would play a bigger role. I thought it would save them. I thought it was maybe their parents or someone who would become their mentor, but in fact we don't really see that. They just kind of, as they're escaping, they see it again. And by the way, that escape off the Queequeg at the end of this book is kind of, I thought that was a little bit of a stretch. What's happening is the porthole is broken, and so they fix it by putting gum and sticking a piece of glass onto that hole, so that when they go up and they go into the water and they sort of rise up into they sort of ascend up, that holds. And I'm like, wow, these 3 kids can hold that much pressure. I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. But I wish that Violet would have had time to invent something, and I guess in a way that's a sort of an invention, but something a little bit more stable and steady would have been, I think, a little bit more appreciative, or at least demonstrative of her skills, of her talent. So, but overall, this book was very enjoyable. Number 8, The Bad Beginning. Man, that book is so short. It's like you could read it in, I feel like you could read that book in like 2 hours or less. I thought, actually, I remember thinking all the books were this short. I was like, wow, I'm going to finish this series in like 2 days. But they ended up getting a little bit longer. But The Bad Beginning at number 8, it's pretty appropriate that this book sort of appears near the middle of this sort of rankings list, because, it's one of those books where it's not good or it's not bad. I mean, it's not memorable, but it's also not forgettable. It's the start of this story. It's the start of this series where you understand a little bit more of, I guess this is like the origin story in a way of this entire series. Even though, as they talk about later in the series, which I really like, is that the story of the Bottlers and this whole series, it doesn't start with the first book. It actually starts a lot earlier, and it also doesn't end with the last book. It continues on, and I like that, and how that applies to our lives. It's not, our story is not just when we started. It's actually, it would have started a lot earlier, and I like the fact that they bring this up. Now, The Bad Beginning, it is quite an adjustment to get used to the narrator. It takes a while to understand that the narrator has a personality, that the narrator is also a part of this story, but also a part of his own story. And it also takes a while to get used to the vocabulary, where the interjection of definitions of things, which does sort of tailor off at the end, which I'm glad they kind of stopped doing that. But in the beginning, it's like, whoa, like every other page, I felt like there's some vocabulary word that someone is trying to explain. And so it's nice. It does take some time to get used to, but it should, I think, draw readers in. The fact that the book is so short, I think, is also a really great positive for this. That if you want to read more, it's good. It is a little unrealistic that a 14-year-old could be married, but I guess they cover it up with legalese, and again, that's sort of the reader having to suspend their disbelief a little bit in this entire story. But I feel like the real strength of this book is the narrator. It leads very strong with the narrator, and something that the reader will have to get used to if they are going to continue to read the rest of this series. So again, neither memorable nor forgettable, but one of those books that is very important for this entire series because you have to have a first book. Number 7 is the Carnivore Carnival. And this was one of the books where the kids were on their own. But I realized after doing the drawing video, the summary video for this channel, that most of the time the kids are undercover because they're dressed up as the House of Freaks workers, the two-headed person and the wolf baby, or the bear baby, or the dog baby. Like, they're not really themselves for a lot of this story, and they're kind of just trying to figure out what they're going to do because they don't really have a plan. Count Olaf and Madame Lulu are working together, and they seem to be very much empowered in this story, whereas the kids are the kind of the ones sneaking around, trying to figure out how they're going to get out of here because they can't just run away because there's nowhere to go. They're in the middle of the hinterlands, which to me is like the desert. So I don't know what they're going to do, at least in this story. There's no real clear-cut plan. One of the things that I find is very sad, and again, this sort of relates back to Aunt Josephine, is about character motivation. And what is the motivation of Madame Lulu? I have no idea. I would love to know what people think about what is her motivation. What is Madame Lulu's motivation in this story? Does she give up the kids at the end? That's one of the things that I want to know what the Netflix series is going to do. And I might have to end up going back and rereading that last part of the book where Count Olaf figures it out. I guess at some point he knows who they are. But is it Madame Lulu who gives them up, or does he just figure it out? And I think that is so important. It's so important to understand character motivation and who they really are. So that's one of the things that I'm very curious about in this story. But very sad that she died in this book. One last thing I do want to mention is the idea of mob psychology. And this book talks about peer pressure later on directly, but the idea of mob psychology where you can turn the opinion of a crowd. And maybe, again, this is something that kids may not understand, but something that I feel like is very, very important to understand when it comes to critical thinking. And so, although it didn't work in this book, they at least introduced the idea of, maybe we can change all of their minds if we just start whispering and saying things, and soon the crowd will kind of, join with us. And I feel like maybe we don't have physical crowds anymore, but we do have online crowds where people say things or they make comments or write articles, and sooner or later you start hearing all these things, and regular people start believing it, and that's sort of how it turns. And that's one of the things that I hope that readers see, especially readers who are older. They recognize that, like, this happens in real life where this mob psychology actually works, and what beliefs do I have that were influenced by mob psychology. I think it's important to sort of do some self-reflection on that, so that if you believe something, maybe it's for an actual reason, not because you just see a lot of Reddit posts or articles online or Facebook posts. So I think that was very, very important to introduce here. Something to give readers, I think, something to think about. Number 6, The Slippery Slope. So I remember reading The Slippery Slope, and this was one of the biggest surprises in this series, was the introduction of Quigley, which was one of the things that kind of caught me off guard. Quigley is the third triplet of the Quagmires, and who was thought to have died in the fire. Which, again, in a way, you kind of buy into that that character is gone, and then they come back, and it's like, whoa, what a surprise! And the explanation of him surviving, I guess, is somewhat plausible. It's interesting, but it really got me wanting to continue to read more, because I remember at the end of that chapter, I was like, wait, what? Quigley? And I stayed up, and I ended up reading, I don't know if I read the rest of the book, but I read at least a lot more of the book. I couldn't stop after that part because I thought that was really good. We also are introduced to the man with a beard but no hair, and the woman with hair but no beard. And I thought that these two characters would play a significant role in this entire series, which kind of did, but not really, not to the extent that I thought. I thought that basically they were the bosses. That Count Olaf was like the middle boss, who we thought was the big boss, but actually these would be the top people in the bad guy organization. And it really wasn't the case. They were just very scary, and Count Olaf was afraid of them too. But to me, they never ended up paying off. Like, that persona that they gave off, that very, very afraid, and everyone has to be afraid. It never really came to fruition. It didn't really sort of develop in that way. But I think that the thing that really impressed me the most, although the story maybe had been a little weaker in this particular book, was when the two women with white faces walked away from Count Olaf. And I hope that in the Netflix series they take the time to show this, because those two women were associates of Count Olaf for a long time. Some associates died, but they voluntarily walked away because they figured out and they could think for themselves that possibly maybe their parents died and they were made orphans because of all this like shenanigans. And I really like the fact that that's something that is brought up in this story. The fact that characters willingly and on their own, they sort of in a way matured, they thought for themselves, and they walked away. I also like the discussion on what is a bad guy, or what can you get away with until you cross that line from good guy to bad guy. And this is something that Violet is struggling with in this story, because they make a trap for Mrs. Squalor to catch her. And as they're digging this pit, they're trying to think in their minds, well, are we being just as bad as Count Olaf? What separates us from them? And they make the right choice to not use the pit. But the fact that they were that close, it's one of those you're going to cross into the dark side of the Force type of moments. And they make the right choice. They don't compromise. There are times where they made poor choices, where they tricked Hal into getting the keys. But in this instance, they decided that this was not the way that they were going to go, and that there was a better way. And I like that. I like that they didn't feel like they had to stoop down to that level. Moving down to the top 5. Number 5, the Austerity Academy. Now, to me, this is one of the earliest books where I felt like, oh, okay, the story is finally shifting. It wasn't where Count Olaf would come in and pretend to be somebody in order to directly steal the kids. I felt like the plan was a little bit more sophisticated, in the sense that Count Olaf would be their gym teacher who would run them every night, so they would get tired, so that they would do poor in school, so that they would have to be homeschooled and they get kicked out of school. I thought that was a little more complicated, and that added an extra layer of sophistication that we didn't have in any of the other stories. A lot of the other stories, it seemed, especially up to this point, were, well, we're just gonna mess around and just take it, But this one, it had an extra layer, and it made it, I think, set up a lot of the later plans in how he was actually going to go and get their fortune. We also are introduced to the Quagmires, who in a way become reoccurring characters. I wish we would have seen them a little bit later at the end of the book. I thought it would have been nice to reunite them all together. You have the 3 Baudelaires and the 3 Quagmires, and that would have been really nice. But this is where we meet them, and we also meet Carmelita as well. But we meet those characters, and I thought that they were really great best friends. They were, I was going to say foils, but they weren't foils. They were best friends. They were people that the Baudelaires could grow up with. And in this community of volunteers, we have like the Baudelaires' parents and like the Snicket family, and they seem to be very close. And a lot of other families seem to be very close in this organization. And I thought that maybe that would happen with the Quagmires. I thought that the Baudelaires and the Quagmires would become that best friend families, and they'd be able to do these things together. But it doesn't really pan out that way. I mean, they do work together in this book, but they don't necessarily develop that long-term family ties. And of course, towards the end, we don't really see them again. But I thought this was it was a nice change, where it was some sophistication. A lot of it was environmental versus rather than direct in terms of the conflict. And how the story ended with the Quagmires being kidnapped, I thought was nice, because now there's more purpose. Now there's more drive for the Baudelaires to chase Count Olaf rather than Count Olaf chasing them the entire time. So I thought that was a very nice change. Number 4, the Hostile Hospital. Now, this book was nice because I like the fact that the kids were finally split up in a way. It's book number 8. Most of this series, the kids are all working together as 3, which is good. But in this one, we really see a separation between Violet and Klaus and Sunny, because Klaus and Sunny get separated in the library, and they go down the chute, and then Violet is sort of captured, and then they're going to do the head thing on her. So it's the two of them. It's the middle and the younger one that have to work together, and then they figure out that they're going to disguise themselves as doctors. And the fact that they pull it off, I think, is kind of funny, because it's the first time where, you know, the people, the Count Olaf's accomplices, fall for these terrible disguises. I mean, clearly you have a baby and a young boy, and they dress up as a doctor, and then for some reason people just think they're doctors. So I think that it's nice to have that turn where the ridiculousness of the outfits, the disguises, actually works on them. And so I thought that was very nice. That was a nice little change in this entire story. But I think on a more personal note, it reminds me of my time where I volunteered in a hospital. And I know the VFD in this story is the volunteers fighting diseases. And, you know, they go around cheering up patients. And I think the reason why this book stood out to me was because I did a lot of volunteering when I was in college. I did a lot of volunteering at the local hospitals and nursing homes. And I did a very similar thing. And I didn't have a song, or I didn't give out, balloons with a heart on it. But just the fact that you go out there and you make people feel better. I like that. And I know we didn't really get into the VFD in this story, but just the fact that this story had that element to it, I think that's the reason why I ranked it so high. And I really appreciate this story a lot. Number 3, the penultimate peril. Now, this story is very confusing because you have the twins, or the triplets. You have the two managers, one of whom is good, the other one is bad. And every time they refer to the characters, we have no idea who it is. This hotel is very chaotic because it's the way that it's organized by the Dewey Decimal System. It is just, sometimes it doesn't make any sense. It almost is as complicated to me as the library in the hospital and how you're supposed to find anything in that hospital. But what I really like about this story was that we bring back a lot of characters. I love long series, or I shouldn't say long series. I like series of books that bring back characters. I love television shows that bring back characters, especially characters that we haven't seen in a long time, and they bring them back. And in this book, they brought back Justice Strauss, Jerome Squaller, and I was like, yes, that's so good. They brought back a couple of the other teachers, but I love the fact that they're bringing back these characters, and I was so excited because I thought that they would finally bring back the Quagmires, but they don't, and I was like, oh, that's too bad. But I really like the fact that they bring back the characters in this story. It's very exciting to me, and they bring back Sir and Charles and those other people. The death of Dewey in this story was so good. It's so good, and I hope that when the Netflix show does this one, that this got to be the slow motion. When he is falling into the water and he's going down into the water, and the camera tracks him and it gets him from the back, it gets him from the top and from the side, and the air bubbles. I really hope they do this death scene really well, because it is sad. I wish we would have gotten to know Dewey a little bit more, other than in this book, and I think almost past halfway through the book. But the fact that he dies, and his relationship with Kit, and what's going to happen with all that, and it's so good. It's so good. I just wish we would have gotten to know that character a little bit more. He's trying to help these kids out. Finally, someone who actually is just straight up telling them stuff, answering questions. But he doesn't make it, and I really thought that was well done in the book, and I hope that the show does that justice as well. Number 2, which might be kind of a surprise, is The Miserable Mill. Now, this is an early book. It's book number 4, and I know it kind of falls into that whole, Balders go to a guardian, and they have to go and escape, and there's Count Olaf. But what I liked about this story, again, being book number 4, is the conflict was not against Count Olaf. I never felt like it was against Count Olaf the entire time. The real conflict was against their environment. It was against their working conditions. And, there's commentary here about, equal pay and the fact that the lumber mill workers don't get paid. They get paid in coupons, but they can never buy anything, is to me really, really good social commentary on real life, where, I often thought, what if people don't earn enough money, or they spend so much money on commuting, on lunch, on expenses to go to work, that often by the time they get home, they actually don't make any money. And it's kind of a sad thought. And so that's sort of what I thought about when I read this book. And for the kids, they're rich kids. They grew up in a very privileged house, and they had really, very, very great parents, but they never actually had to work hard. And I love that they got to get their hands dirty. I love that, you got these white collar, upper middle class kids, and now you're throwing them into this, physical type of working environment. And I liked that, because again, for myself, I had to do something like that too, where after college, I thought I'd have an office job, but I ended up doing a very physical, labor intensive job, and I learned a lot. And I thought that the kids grew up a lot in this story because they had to, no one was going to hold their hand. And the fact that Count Olaf is not in this story. I know in the Netflix series he like from the start, he's like right there. But in the book, he was almost invisible, and the kids were wondering, where is Count Olaf? And I guess we escaped him. And it was nice that the kids didn't have to deal with him. They had to deal with other problems, more real problems. And that's why when I read this book, I thought, man, this book is great. I really like it. Now, again, the story, it kind of falls on that similar story where, they're going to kick him out to the next Guardian. But the fact that there's so many other things going on in this story. This was one of the best books, obviously being number 2, but it was really one of the best books early on that I felt like solidified, okay, this series I'm going to really enjoy. And I'm glad that I got to get it at book number 4. And now the number 1 book, which if you do the process of elimination, you'll figure out my favorite book in this series is The End, which is sort of a cheat because it's the last book, but it's the 13th book. And there's so much stuff to talk about this one book. It's a very enjoyable conclusion. I'll try not to spoil stuff. It's a very enjoyable conclusion to this series. It reminds me very much of Lost, because the book takes place on a sort of a deserted island in the middle of nowhere. The scene that really got me was when the kids went to the other side of the island, and all the stuff that had come ashore on the island that the people had dragged away, and they basically put it in quarantine. When they're walking through that and they see all the different things that washed up, which is like everything of everything, right? Everything washes up on shore eventually. I really like that. I could envision that in my mind, and I really appreciated that. I hope that when they do the series on Netflix, that scene is in slow motion with a nice music, and they're just looking around and they're kind of soaking it all in. That was a very, very powerful scene, because to me, it brought the rest of the world, to that island. And again, it's one of those lost television show moments where it's just like, wow, like what is going on? I thought there's gonna be some kind of like crazy monster or something going on this island, but it's very much, it's very tame. There's no magic or mystery or anything like that. One of the things that is hard to do in a series this long is tie up all the loose ends. And again, we see this in television shows all the time. There are too many loose ends to tie up in this series. There's just too many. But I felt like the book did a good job on at least half closing some of the ending or some of the storylines that we might be curious about. Again, there are some that I was like, why don't you bring those characters back? What happened to them? What's going to do? Or what are they going to do? What's going to happen? But it doesn't ever get solved, and that's okay. And I learned to accept that as the reader. I learned to accept that. I was surprised that there's a chapter 14 in this book, and I guess it makes sense because if you do the math, it's going to be 169, and then the author already says it's going to be 170 chapters, I believe. So that makes sense that this one had an extra chapter on it to sort of close things out. But it's always hard to close out a long series, and you're putting in so much time to get to know these characters, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny, and the amount of growing up that these characters have gone through, especially Sunny. I know it doesn't seem like she's an important character, but at the end of this series, she's changed to me the most out of the three main characters. And again, this isn't just a physical thing where she can now talk and walk, but she has a specialty now, and she has opinions on her own, and she is reminding the other siblings of their parents. And I appreciate that for a character that was sort of a secondary character for a lot of this series. I would definitely like to know what happens to the Baudelaires and what they do after this series, after this story ends. But as the author points out, the story is not over. It doesn't end at the end. It doesn't end when the words stop, because their story continues on, and their story did not begin with the bad beginning. It was going on before that. And to tie it into our real life, we're also not limited by that. Our stories don't end when we stop, and they don't begin when we begin. They continue on well later, and they start well before we're even here. And I like that notion. I was thinking about what the overall meaning behind this series meant, and what is the purpose. Like, what would a kid get out of a series of unfortunate events after reading it? And I came to the conclusion that after reading this long tale about these kids who go through these bad events, maybe we can realize that our life isn't as bad as theirs, or we can realize that despite all the challenges, they were able to overcome it. That if you lose a parent, your life is not doomed. You don't have to have a bad life, and that you can make choices to be good or bad, and often switching sides, I guess, if you really want. But these kids, they can teach us that you can choose to be good, and that while the world may be growing more and more bad, I guess, relatively bad, that there are still people out there that are fighting for good, and you can choose to be on the good side. You don't have to be on the bad side. And I think it gives a lot of people hope. Hopefully it gives kids hope who are reading these books, that these are people that they can look up to. That life is not great maybe for that child, but it doesn't have to be that way. They can escape that. And if you have friends, if you have siblings, if you have guardians, people who can help you, then you can make that happen, that can be possible for you, that you don't have to be limited by your circumstances, whether they're bad because someone is doing it to you on purpose, or bad because it just randomly happened. And so that's one of the things that I look back on this series and I think about. So thanks for watching this video. I know it's quite long, but it's a lot of books, and I really enjoyed it. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.